ILO Talks. I'm Nozi Poshabalala, and what an absolute privilege to be your host once again. Now, the big question that we are answering today is, how might we keep the promise of change post-COVID-19? How might we keep the promise of change post-COVID-19? Now, if we take a step back, we know that 2020 came with a range of necessary lockdown measures, and we know that on the back of these measures, there was a lot of economic and labor market losses. However, perhaps more importantly, is that the most vulnerable have really had to bear the brunt of these losses. And in addition to this, if we look at some of the latest analysis that is coming out of the International Labour Organization, we realize that we are confronted with a fork in the road. On the one hand, we know that there's the possibility to experience recovery, especially as vaccination programs take effect. But on the other hand, we also know that there is the possibility and the risk of uneven, unsustainable recovery that comes with growing inequality and even comes with instability. And so our sub-question needs to be, what needs to be true for us to choose the road of positive change, a road of change that comes with human-centered recovery, that comes with employment, that comes with income and social protection, that comes with social dialogue and workers' rights. And so to help us answer these questions today, we have a very special guest in the form of Professor Mariana Mazzucato. She is, of course, the Professor of Economics of Innovation and Public Value at University College London, or UCL, where she's also the founding director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. We also know her as the author of 3 acclaimed books, The Entrepreneurial State, The Value of Everything, and just most recently, the newly released Mission Economy, a moonshot guide to changing capitalism. So she's going to kick us off with today's ILO Talks in response to this question. But as always, we know that we've got a panel discussion, and I'll be introducing our panelists a little bit later as they respond to Prof. Mazzucato. Now, before I hand over to our Prof, I do want to extend an additional invitation to you. Help us to amplify the conversation on social media. We're using the hashtag ILO Talks. Of course, an invitation for you to follow the ILO Talks either in English, French, or Spanish. And of course, you'll see my colleague Maya on your screen with the International Sign Language interpretation. So we're really trying to make these conversations as inclusive as possible. One more request, one more way to get your voice in this conversation. I'm going to be pausing. From time to time, I'm going to be introducing polls, asking you questions that really help us put our finger on the pulse of what you think about the associated issues to today's questions. So, Mariana, how do we keep the promise of change post-COVID-19? It's over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that kind introduction. And I'm going to limit my comments to 9 minutes. I have a timer here, so don't worry, I won't go over. And you've really, I think, hit the nail, which is we talk about building back better. There's that language, and it's not just Biden. This was already being talked about in Europe even before Biden was elected. This idea of, we don't have the right system. The wrong system has gotten us this crisis and multiple different types of crises. Let's not waste this opportunity. And I want to kind of, dig deep into what that actually means. How can we make sure that building back better actually is driven by an agenda on what it is we want to create, how we want to create it, and especially how we should distribute the gains in a much more equitable way than we have so far. And to do that, I think it's always important to remember, that the word capitalism is kind of just this fuzzy word. Actually, there's all sorts of different ways to do capitalism. There's varieties of capitalism, and I fundamentally think that we have the wrong type of capitalism. Just very briefly, excuse me for being a bit superficial here, but with 9 minutes, what do I mean by that? I mean, if you look at so many of the different types of institutions that we have, they are being both, problematically governed, but also the ways that the different organizations in the public and the private sphere are related one to another are also very problematic. And I just want to give you a bit of a brief, that's what I meant, overview of that. First of all, finance, the financial sector. We know finance is very important. We often say we need green finance, or we need finance for SMEs. We need finance for X, Y, and Z. However, unfortunately, what we've seen in the last kind of 3 decades is that finance has become overly financialized. In other words, so much of global finance goes back into the financial sector. In the UK, where I'm sitting today, 80% of funds go into finance, insurance, and real estate. They don't even hit the real economy, let alone getting the real economy industry to become more green and so on. Second, in the corporate sector, unfortunately, we also have financialization, and the numbers are quite striking there as well. In the last 10 years, the the S&P 500 companies have spent over $4 trillion just to buy back their shares, which ends up boosting share prices, stock options, and executive pay. So this lack of reinvestment back into the economy is a huge problem. And when we hear robots are taking jobs, it's simply not true. You know, robots, mechanization, the Industrial Revolution for 2 centuries has been labor displacing, but as long as profits were reinvested back into the economy, new jobs appeared, new skills, and so on. Of course, with huge pressure from trade unions and making sure that also happened in a particular way. But this lack of reinvestment is really quite striking. And you see it, by the way, with global figures of investment as a share of global GDP. And third, government. Governments, unfortunately, so many different types of public institutions have basically been convinced that their role at best is there to fix a market failure. So by definition, you're always too little, too late. You actually have to wait that something fails, or thinking that something might fail, before you do anything about it. So there's this lack of real kind of objective to admit that actually the economy has not just a rate, but a direction. And that directionality must, in fact, come from, ambitious public policy, which steers, which tilts the playing field, doesn't level the playing field, tilts the playing field towards a direction to make sure that the economy is truly inclusive, sustainable, and so on. And, what that means is really a new language. It's not about market fixing, it's about co-creating and co-shaping the markets of the future and the economy of the future. And that's not just government, of course, that's also business, that's trade unions, civil society organizations, in terms of co-creating the economy, but policy needs to confront that directionality head on. And that means that needs to land also in particular types of tools, whether it's grants, loan, procurement policies that really do then foster this kind of much needed change that we require. And what kind of change? I've already mentioned inclusive and sustainable, but we need to make it even more ambitious than that, right? Since 2015, we have the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 goals, 169 targets beneath them. And unless we take those seriously and embed the goals and an outcomes-driven approach into the policies, then we're simply not going to achieve them. So, the second point is that if we don't do this, if we don't kind of, reform finance, reform business, rethink government, and absolutely have kind of a co-creation strategy with trade unions, which I'll come to towards later in the talk, at the center of really also making sure that we benefit from the movement. Trade unions as having supplied the movement in the history of capitalism to make sure, in fact, the kind of economy we have is more inclusive, right? We wouldn't have weekends, we wouldn't have 8-hour workdays, we would still have children in factories if we hadn't had those types of movements. What does it actually mean to co-create the economy? And if we don't do this, we will simply go from one crisis to another. And what the COVID crisis has, woken us up to, on the back of the climate crisis, the financial crisis, is we are so badly prepared. We are so badly prepared to deliver even basic things like personal protection equipment. We have a digital divide that means so many children globally, in both the developed and the developing part of the world, have not accessed their human right to education. We've had test and trace systems which just have failed because we didn't have the capacity on the ground. It wasn't rolled out properly. But we also have a vaccine, but the governance of the vaccine currently is very problematic. As Dr. Tedros tells us, we currently have vaccine apartheid, with 70% of the doses being hoarded by a few countries. So how do we actually govern our system, production, distribution, consumption patterns, again, with this idea of directed growth at the center? And to do that, what I do in the book is I bring this notion of a missions approach. And really what that does is to say, look, let's start again from the SDGs, but admit that what we need to do is put the notion of purpose and this term stakeholder value, which we often hear in business circles, at the center of public-private partnerships and at the center of how trade unions are also engaging in public-private partnerships. In other words, we start with the goal and then work backwards and ask, what does that actually mean for industrial strategy, for innovation policy, for development policy, but also the contracts on the ground. I already mentioned them before, the procurement, the grants, the loan, the subsidies have to be designed in such a way to both foster bottom-up experimentation towards the goals themselves, whether it's a clean ocean, a carbon neutral city, or also social issues around inequality. We can form different types of missions around them. But what we require is really, again, a new type of social contract, which has, and this is sort of the second point, conditionality at the core. I was quite interested when, President Macron said, in terms of the French recovery program, he said, we're not here just to bail out industry, we're here to help transform it. And he put some strong conditions attached to the recovery funds that airlines and automobiles got. They had to commit to reducing their carbon emissions. In Austria and Denmark, they had to commit to stop using tax havens. Elizabeth Warren in the US was trying to get the US CARE Act to make sure there was conditions attached to make sure that those companies benefiting from the recovery funds would actually reinvest their profits back into the economy, as opposed to, again, engaging in these massive dividend payouts and share buybacks. And again, working conditions and workers being invested in terms of training, but also better working conditions, has to be at the center of that conditionality process. So conditions on carbon emissions, on working conditions, on reinvestment of profits at the center, not only of a recovery scheme during a COVID crisis, but really at the center of how we think about the ways that finance basically gets distributed in the system. Because otherwise, what we end up having is what happened with the financial crisis, which again was seen as big historic moment. Huge amounts of liquidity were poured into the system. Most of that liquidity ended up again back into the financial sector itself. And we've ended up again with different countries, including the UK, with record levels of private debt to disposable income. We have not gone to the source of the problem. So my last 20 seconds here, I just want to repeat, the Build Back Better agenda has to be putting a common purpose at the center of these, huge amounts of funds that are being put into the system, a purpose around the sustainable development goals, landing them though in specific, places through agendas that truly are co-created, but also the contracts, the social contract, but the design of the portfolio of different types of instruments, grants, loans, bailouts, recovery, have to actually embed this notion of purpose within them. Otherwise, we're wasting this opportunity, and we can't afford to do that. Thank you.
Well, there it is. Mariana, thank you so much. I mean, you started off by saying it's going to be brief because it's just 9 minutes, but it's been an incredible framing of the opportunity that we have right now to cascade this conversation a little bit deeper. You started off by speaking about the problematic nature of governance in our institutions. You walked us into that disconnect between reinvestment and the needs in the real economy. You went to the opportunity for more ambitious public policy as part of the response, but that also landing on effective instruments that we should be considering. I really love the idea as you were tapping into the different stakeholders, whether we're talking about the movement from the trade unions, but how do we put stakeholder value back at the center of public-private partnerships? And of course, you speak about conditions as one of the ways that we can really step up to the question of how do we keep that promise of change post-COVID-19. So what I would like to do at this moment is I want to maybe pause. I want to go to our audience because we're going to go into a panel discussion. And in that panel, I'm going to remind the audience that you have a Q&A chat box that I can see is already being populated with questions. And I want to encourage you to please keep sending us your questions so that we can really engage with what we've heard Prof. Mazzucato sharing with us. But here's a quick poll for you first. I'm going to ask our team to launch this poll. The question that is on your screen right now is, what is your priority for building a better future of work right now? We've heard a lot from Prof. Mazzucato, but what is your priority? Is it action on climate change? Do you think it needs to be reduced inequalities? Is it about supporting small businesses? Is it about more job stability? Is it about rights at work? I'm going to give it about 30 seconds as you as you complete this quick poll, because I do want us to take your voice into the panel discussion that is to follow. So I'm going to give it maybe about 15 more seconds as we take that quick poll and see what the results of that poll are in a short minute. Now, as you continue to take the poll, allow me just to maybe very briefly introduce our next speakers as part of our panel. We are going to hear from the Director General of the International Labour Organization, Mr. Guy Ryder. We're going to hear from Joanna Bernice Coronacion. She has given me the permission to call her nice. She is, of course, the Deputy Secretary General of Centro, which is the Center of United and Progressive Labour, and I do believe would have some views on what Professor Mazzucato has shared with us. We're also going to hear from Alicia Rodriguez Pardo, who is the CEO of Inclusion Consulting Group. This is a firm that specializes in labor, economic, financial, and social inclusion. So we're going to go to them shortly, but for now, the results are on your screen. 49%, which is just about half of the 278 people who have connected on today, are saying the priority has to be the reduction of inequalities, and that's how we're going to build a better future of work. It is about a reduction in inequalities. So that's quite interesting, because I would love our panelists to maybe just to also reflect on that as we go into the conversation. I'm going to invite the Director General, Mr. Guy Ryder, to maybe kick us off. DG, we're hearing our audience saying it is about the reduction of inequalities. But in addition to that, might you respond to the question of what do you think the priority actions need to be if we are going to ensure that this promise of change for a better future is actually kept? Over to you, Mr. Guy Ryder.
Thanks very much, Nosy. My quick answer to your question is that I agree with the previous speaker, because Professor Mazzucato has given us, I think, a lot of the answers. We're in the midst of this pandemic from which we should learn some lessons, I think. But the biggest lesson of all is, I think, we've made the promises, keeping the promise. The promise was made in the SDGs, the 2030 Development Agenda, and, pre-pandemic, the promise was not being kept. And there was a contradiction in what we were doing and what we are doing. What's the contradiction? We've set ourselves a transformational agenda. It calls itself a transformational agenda to deliver all of these wonderful goals, but we simply refused to adjust the policy settings that could reasonably be expected to produce transformation. So I absolutely agree with Professor Mazzucato that now we can't simply adjust the settings. We have to change the settings of our policy approaches. I agree fundamentally that we have lost either the capacity or the will to actually make capitalism work in the way that it actually was designed to work and to spread its benefits. Why? Some would say globalization, some would say technology, some would say political will has been missing, but we've got to go back to some basics here. And yes, it's about the institutions of work, it's about the actors of work, it's about investing in the jobs of the future. But I adhere very, very strongly to this notion, and I like the notion of co-creation in the way our economies work and deliver. I think this notion of a new social contract, because that implies buy-in by the actors, is really powerful. And it goes directly to the notion of greater equity in our world, because you buy into a contract when you think you're getting out of it what you put into it. And whilst Professor Mazzucato was quite rightly, in my view, emphasized the role of social movements and organized labor, I sometimes believe as well, speaking to business representatives, that they also find themselves trapped by this financialization of business behavior. Finance has become self-serving rather than a servant of the real economy and of the needs of us all. And we've got to put these things right. And yes, let's think of this co-creative social contract approach and draw the logical consequences of that and what we're living through today in the pandemic.
Mr. Gairada, thank you so much. As always, really speaking to the issues on the table. We made a promise, even as we're now faced with this decade of action around the Sustainable Development Goals, we didn't keep that promise. And so the contradiction that we need to overcome right now is not just about adjusting, but it is fundamentally changing. You spoke a lot about being, affirming what we've heard from Prof. Mazzucato, but also raising this idea that let's also not forget that business needs to break out of this particular mold that it finds itself in. Alicia, let me come to you. You've listened to Prof. Mazzucato. You've heard some of the comments from Mr. Gairada. What's your response to this idea of, what might we need to prioritize as actions to ensure that we're able to keep the promise of change post-COVID-19?
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I couldn't. Yes, well, first of all, I would like to thank the invitation, the IOE and the ILO for the invitation for today. And it's a pleasure to be here today with Professor Mazzucato, Gairada, and Mrs. Coronation. No doubt the COVID-19 crisis has changed the way we live, the way we work, the way we see the future. And we all have learned that no one can do it alone. And so I definitely agree that coordination, alliances, and definitely co-creation with purpose are key. The employers' organizations around the world have been really working hard on the forefront, helping business to weather this storm and to lead policies together with governments to raise this awareness, to manage the immediate impact risks, protect workers' health, their well-being, save business, and safeguard jobs. It is definitely not an easy task, but it's not been lessened the compromise to look beyond those immediate responses. There's been work done and continue to be done in develop initiatives for future productivity in an inclusive and sustainable manner. I'm here representing as a sort of like the employers' organizations and the employers' perspective, and definitely they play a key role in many priority actions to be taken in the future. First, in maintaining business support measures to be able to go from survival to thriving, and also creating those purposes and co-creating, while allowing at the same time new enterprises to flourish and create jobs. Second, job creation, labor inclusion, and economic recovery is at the core. An employers' organization can play a pivotal role together with governments in this issue. Third, the world of work has changed. And now more than ever is the moment to rethink new jobs with a wider inclusion lens and a proactive stance towards different vulnerable groups and take them into account and consider their impacts. New business models are needed, and those new skills are fundamental. So also alliances between the private, public sector and academia in a coordination to co-create the ways to give those skills that are really up to the challenges of the new world. And finally, innovation. Innovation is crucial to see new opportunities and service with a purpose. Innovation in social activities, innovation in products and services, and how to reach and how to manage work. And employers' organizations has a unique and timely data that is very useful together with its broad network and future vision initiatives that I think it can add a practical and very much needed practical edge to those future discussions on the future of work and the world we want to build trust to the promise of change.
Alicia, it's a fantastic response that is very much about the underlying theme, which is, of course, this idea of a new social contract where we all are having to refresh and reset our mindsets about our roles and how do we contribute to a world where capitalism actually works, and to use the Director General's words, for what it was intended for. And as you speak about, the future world of work and the opportunity to rethink how we can be more inclusive, or to rethink the future world of work with an inclusive lens, is certainly a conversation that we need to be amplifying in the context of the role of business. So allow me maybe to go to Bernice next, and Bernice, much has been said by Prof. Mazzucato about the potential role of trade unions and how effective movements can really move us closer towards the kind of world and future that we want to co-create together post-COVID-19. And so let me bring to you the question as well of what are you seeing as the priorities that we need to be focusing on if we are going to be keeping that promise of positive change post-COVID-19? Over to you.
Thank you, Nosy, for that question. And of course, I would like to thank Professor Mazzucato for really raising the consciousness of many of our participants here on how the trade union movement have fought for the working people's rights. But for us, the systems that we are currently in will always fail, and it was designed to fail. That's why it's very important that we will always pause an alternative. On the other hand, for us, it's very critical and important that we generate a robust public employment program, because most of the countries are still under recession. And that can be funded by taxing the wealth and use that funds to generate more employment, which embodied the principles of the ILO on decent work. And then, of course, we need to have a universal health services, especially on our public health, so we can expand our public healthcare system and integrate all the key elements that can generate jobs, but at the same time protect the interests of the majority of the people.
Bernice, I think it's a fantastic answer. It's really concise, but as you reflect on the raising of consciousness that's happened in this conversation, you bring us back to the opportunity to create robust employment programs that really deliver the jobs that we're talking about, but also the social protection. And you've elevated the health system as one of the examples. What I'm keen to do now is I do want to give Prof. Mazzucato an opportunity just to reflect back, having listened to some of the priority areas that have been raised by our panelists. Prof. Mazzucato, when you listen to these and you reflect back to the almost the problematic landscape that you started off with, what are some of the key issues that come to the surface for you that you might believe still need further unpacking?
Great. Well, thanks. Really excellent comments. And it's a great honor to be here. It's so important actually to find not only answers to these questions, but to start experimenting, start implementing some of these ideas and learn kind of what works, what doesn't. We know what doesn't work, but we also have to be open to, actually experimenting with better tax policy, but again, redesigning industrial strategies to be less just about giving out money, to be really focused on the goals that we have set ourselves. So one just point I wanted to make on something that that Guy mentioned, Guy Ryder, in terms of co-creation, which I'm glad, Guy, you said you liked. I think one of the issues also for the ILO is, this concept of the just transition is so important, but it's a bit reactive. It's waiting for someone else to set the goals, to talk about sustainability, to have the carbon neutral agenda or the Green Deal, and then labor, rightly so, is asking that, that we actually invest in people so they don't get left behind. Now, when we move to a more sustainable economy, that's completely right. And those conditionalities that I mentioned can be part of that process. But I think co-creation means that different voices need to be at the table ex ante as well, even in defining where do we want to go? What do we even mean by sustainability? And whose voice is at the table? So for example, citizen assemblies are increasingly important, I think, in terms of also really getting people to realize that, policy does matter, how we design our system does matter to your everyday life. But if it's always the usual suspects, some academics, some business leaders, some government officials, and every now a trade union official that's brought to the table kind of tokenistically, then we don't actually have all those different voices. And I think for that, we really also need to experiment with new types of democratic fora for real participation in these decisions. Something that I'm not sure if it's Joanna or Bernice, you called her Bernice, but I see her name up on the screen as Joanna, so forgive me, it's Joanna Bernice, mentioned about healthcare workers and our health systems. We have absolutely realized with COVID-19, we have not been investing in global health systems. And I really think this is a massive wake-up call. We are only as healthy as our neighbors on our street, in our city, in our country, globally. Had this crisis begun for example, in Africa, where health systems are much weaker still than in China, we would all globally be worse off. So in terms of these recovery funds, the trillions going into the system, if they don't land on health systems, we're going to be in a huge, trouble again when the next pandemic arises. But also the word, essential workers or key workers that has been used to describe frontline workers, which Bernice was talking about so eloquently. It's an insult to call someone essential and to clap them on a Thursday, a Wednesday, whichever day was being done in different countries, and then not to really value that work or value the social infrastructure and the physical infrastructure where they work. So really valuing, again, let's just call it for what it is, also the welfare state and all the different social and physical parts of that, but also the people, the humans, the workers at the center of that process, that itself also absolutely has to be a wake-up call. And we've just heard here in the UK, again, after clapping for our health workers, that again, they're not getting the kind of pay rises they need, but also the system itself is really being starved of the kind of money that it requires to be a 21st century innovative health system. And unfortunately, this is true globally.
Prof. Mazzucato, I think what I appreciate most about your response is that it presents additional questions. And I think the more questions we ask, the different types of questions, that's how we progress the conversation. And so what I'm hearing in your response is, have we paused to think about the creation of space for other voices to come to the table, and what experiences and lenses might they add into this idea of co-creating? And how tight or how wide are we defining co-creation as a means? And I'm hearing the call for new democratic fora for us to do that. And then increasingly, of course, is a critical question that you've raised about how are we valuing through social and physical infrastructure the very contribution that we have termed as essential? How does that reflect in the social system? And it's so interesting you speak about a global health system rather than just a national focus, which of course has been the tradition when one thinks about investing in infrastructure. So there's so much to talk about and so many new questions. But what I would like to do is I want to go back to our audience. There's a lot of questions coming through. I'm going to come to your questions in a second, but let's go to a quick poll one more time. I'm going to ask the team to put it up. And the question, of course, is, where would you prefer to work in the future? And we're asking this question in the context of Alicia's contribution, where she really said, there's an opportunity for us just to be more inclusive, even in the way we approach the future of work. And we know that location is, of course, one of the key elements and tenets of the future of work. So would you prefer to work at home? Is it at the office or your place of work? Is it a hybrid of both, or is it other? This one is nice and short and sharp, so I'm going to give you just 20 seconds to complete that poll. Where would you prefer to work from in the future? Are you working at home in the future? Are you working from the office or your workplace? Are you in a hybrid of both, or are you seeing a completely different scenario that we might have missed in this conversation? The results are coming up now in just a second. There we go. And it's an overwhelming majority at 85% that is saying, look, it is about a hybrid of both at 85%. 7% is saying maybe just at home, and 8% is saying at the office. So those are fairly comparable to each other. And that really speaks to the kind of world that we are steadily making our way towards. What I would like to do now is to honor my promise of really taking in some of the questions that you have shared with us in the chat. And I really want to bring them to our audience. And maybe let me start off with the question from Benjamin and Guy Ryder. I'd love to bring this question to you. So Benjamin Otto Ortega Morales says, can the speakers comment on potential successful strategies to reduce inequalities? And of course, Mr. Ryder, this goes straight back to the outcome of that first poll to say, at the top of mind for all of our audience is, everything that we do, the social contract, the stakeholders coming together to co-create, going back to capitalism that actually works, all has to reduce inequality eventually. Your thoughts on that? What are the successful strategies we might need to consider?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, given the importance everybody's given to reducing inequality. I think this is an easy question to answer from my perspective, because we know those countries that do best in reducing inequality. And they're countries with progressive tax systems, they're companies with strong industrial relations and collective bargaining systems, they are countries which take seriously minimum wage policies and take seriously the provision of social protection and public services. So those are the tried and tested recipes for reducing inequality, and we know they work. I mean, there's no mystery here. The fact of the matter is, for whatever reason, be it ideological or other, these policies and these mechanisms and these institutions have been allowed to atrophy to some extent. And I think this underlines this notion that somehow, the idea of social contract, what we think is fair and decent in society, has either been dismantled or allowed to lapse. And it's time to reconstruct it.
Mr. Ryder, it's a beautiful way to actually launch our next question as you speak about the social contract that might have been allowed to be dismantled, and it's time to reconstruct it. And one of the questions that's come through, and Bernice, I'd love to bring this question to you. It comes from Claire Harristy, and Claire is really speaking to the breakdown in the social contract when it comes to what we have described in this conversation as essential workers, which is a point that you raised earlier. And here's the question: how can we value the true value of key workers who too often have poor working conditions? They are faced with low pay, few opportunities to progress upwards. What the current metrics that we have in play, for example, labor productivity, don't allow for this true valuation. And so maybe, Bernice, the question to you is, what might you consider as a way for us to move towards really valuing our essential workers, despite the fact that we seem to be stuck in a social contract where how we measure their value potentially is incorrect?
Thank you so much, Nosy. And to the question of Sister Claire, it's very important because nowadays many people and even government will say, like Professor Mazzucato said earlier, that the workers from the healthcare industries are the essential workers and our heroes. But heroes only by name and label, but not in how we treat them. If we are real heroes, if they are real heroes, they should be their rights should be respected, and their need should be addressed. Because here in the Philippines, when we were announced that we were going to have a lockdown, there's no public transportation to be used by the working people, especially our frontliners. So it's not easy for them. They go by walking or riding bicycles, and then when they reach the workplace, they are so tired, but the work is still demanding. And then during the pandemic, there will be retrenchment while people are losing their jobs. So those are some of the problems that we have encountered and our union members have experienced. So if we want to say that they are essential workers and they are the heroes, then their rights should be respected and their demands should be responded.
Yeah, Bernice, that's a fantastic response. You really are pointing us to how do we overcome this particular contradiction or conundrum, especially when it comes to essential or key workers. And you're mapping out here some of their real realities. And maybe, Alicia, I want to come to you. There's a really good question here from Lucian Plowman. And Lucian is saying, how do we integrate a stakeholder value approach in policy when the ambition of the market under the current system is growth or output, especially doing so in the interest of either enhancing assets or capital wealth? And the sub-question that Lucian is asking, Alicia, is, do we need to move away from GDP as a common national measurement? Is that one of the solutions we should be looking at? Alicia?
Yes, thank you. Very interesting question. Of course, there are a lot to be thought about all this. Measuring by GDP always gives you the sense of the economic value more than anything else. And again, we have to see in an integrated manner and also take into account how much value, not only economic value you're creating, you're also creating social value in the process. And to do so, it needs to rethink the way business value the way they obtain the returns and their benefits, because human capital is something very important, and human capital have to feel comfortable in where they're working, in the area where they're working, safe and included, to be creative, and that brings innovation, and that innovation is precisely what trickles down in tangible and intangible results. So it is possible to create economic value without sacrificing social value in the process. So it is a big challenge. It cannot be done alone. A tri-party discussion in a social dialogue is fundamental to create the basis and create awareness on that. And the compromise of companies to take a broad stand on this and work towards like Professor Mazzucato was saying, with a purpose. Technology, not at the speed of technology, but technology as an enhancer towards getting to that purpose. Returns not as the main objective, but return because also can be reinvested properly in also social value. So all these issues need to be fine-tuned and work together in a social dialogue scheme.
Alicia, you are highlighting the power of the both and. It is the genius of both economic and social. You speak about using technology as an enabler, and coming back to the point that was made by Prof. Mazzucato as well, as of course Mr. Guy Ryder, this idea of really coalescing around a common purpose and a common vision. So Prof. Mazzucato, I'd love to bring you into the conversation again. I think there's a brilliant question here from Sharon Chitambo. And Sharon is saying, let's just put some spotlight on some of the developing countries for a moment. And in particular, let's look at Sub-Saharan Africa. And Sharon is saying, how do you see developing countries, particular Sub-Saharan Africa, building back better? What would be the key building blocks? And I would imagine for this question is, she's asking for quite a specific regional lens, Prof. Mazzucato. Your thoughts on Sharon's question?
So it's a great question, and maybe I can just make it a bit less specific, and also just look at Africa as a continent, where, by the way, a lot of the experimentation I was talking about before is actually happening, especially around the green economy. If we look at what's happening in Rwanda and Ethiopia, it's in some ways also more inspirational than in some places that just aren't moving in other parts of the world. However, the reaction often to my work when I talk about the entrepreneurial state or missions and purpose within government, or new concepts of public purpose and public value, or dynamic capabilities within the public sector, which are often missing because of too much outsourcing to consulting companies, which was a whole other but interesting conversation. The reaction I get from my African colleagues, and specifically actually in South Africa, where I am an advisor for the president at Ramaphosa, is, okay, fine, that works, in Europe, but when you have weak states, it doesn't work. And I think that's a problematic lens. When we have weak states, the challenge is much, much greater. But if we don't build strong state institutions, public institutions, and I'm not just talking about funding, health systems, as we've all agreed has to happen, but literally the capabilities within the public sector in order for it to be purpose-driven, in order for the different tools, procurement, which, procurement is a huge budget part of every country's budget, whether they are in Africa, Latin America, Australia, US, and so on. How can you actually, for example, redesign procurement? So government as purchaser, with also, again, conditions attached, in order to drive innovation towards public and kind of common goals. That's how we got to the moon. That's how the moon landing worked. NASA was very careful about how it designed the procurement. And they were also very careful that they had to keep investing in their own capability in order not to just get captured and corrupted by what the head of procurement in NASA called brochuremanship. Wonderful word, because they didn't have PowerPoints at the time. They just had sexy brochures. And so all these issues of how do you invest within the civil service in order to make it more capable? How can we get more dynamic, symbiotic, mutualistic public-private partnerships? But also, I've already talked about conditions between public and private. There's also conditions between public and public. In countries in Africa, for example, where there's state-owned companies, and I'm thinking, again, in South Africa, ESCOM, but different African countries have either state-owned companies or public banks and so on. How can we make sure they themselves are designed in such a way that really is built for a transformative type of growth, and not just kind of ownership and public ownership as an excuse to just kind of stay in place? So Nazi, I'm thinking of ESCOM in South Africa. You know, unfortunately, it's not really right now part of the solution. It's part of the problem. And yet it gets huge amounts of public money because it is a state-owned enterprise. So instead of thinking in the old way of, you know, public versus private, really getting capable public actors and rethinking the civil service, valuing the civil service for all the reasons we've said, but also making sure that there's proper training, less outsource, proper partnership. So it's not business versus the state, but that issue of a dynamic mutualistic partnership, both between public and public and public and private, from my experience, is even more needed in countries that have weak states. And just one last thing in terms of corruption, which is talked about so often. You know, I'm from Italy, so we know about corruption. The mafia, the Italian mafia, which everyone knows from Hollywood movies, came about because in Sicily, there was a weak state. So people just felt like no one was looking after them. So they had to set up these mutual help organizations. La Società dei Beati Paoli was the first kind of mafia organization. And then it built up into what we all know it today, but it actually came from a weak state. So, you know, we know the problems that can come from weak states and then what happens also with corruption for that. So one of the key issues is also to have metrics, just like we have ESG metrics inside the private sector, we need equivalently ambitious metrics around public value creation within the public sector.
So, Prof. Mazzucato, you've literally walked us right through into the conversation that we want to take as a poll, because as you speak about investing within, as you speak about building capability, as you speak about really investing in the capability of the state, it is about building the capability, and it is about skill. So I'm going to launch our final poll for this conversation, and here it is on your screen right now. Have you learned new skills for your current or future job during the last 18 months? Yes, no, I plan to. I lack access to education opportunities. I'm keen to see the results of this, because it really speaks to whether we are experiencing a gap in terms of building the capability in public and in private institutions alike. So I'm going to ask the team to close that poll now. Have you learned new skills? Is it yes, no? Is it an I intend to? And how interesting that we're seeing that in the almost 300 global audience that is on here with us today, that 78% is saying, yes, I actually have learned new skills, either for my current or future job. And I've done this in the last 18 months. And so, Prof. Mazzucato, as you speak and you use the example of state-owned enterprises and you use the examples of ESCOM, all of this really resonates strongly, because we have to build the muscle of our public institutions. And again, it's almost as what Alicia was saying, it's both and. We don't have the luxury of focusing on one and not the other. So I have made a promise to all of you that we're going to try and really get into the meat of this conversation. And I really hope that the team can see, based on the amount of interaction that has come from all of you, that we need to have more of these conversations. As we close off, I'm going to ask my panelists, including, of course, Prof. Mazzucato, just to give us a final thoughts. As we close off, we have 2 minutes and I've got 4 voices that I'd like to integrate. So in 30 seconds each, I'd like you all to kick us off by just completing the following sentence for me: to keep the promise. And I'd like you to complete that sentence, to keep the promise. And of course, for all of those who are tweeting hashtag ILO Talks, this is what we're going to tweet to take this conversation forward. I'm going to start off with Alicia. Alicia, I'm going to put you on the spot first. I'm going to invite you to switch on your camera. I'm going to invite you to come back on screen, and I'm going to ask you to complete this sentence. Remember, you've got 140 characters. It's a tweet, so it is not an executive summary. To keep the promise, Alicia, can you kick us off? To keep the promise.
Well, to keep the promise is definitely the moment to adopt an inclusion lens that involves everyone, and to work together, co-create, and keep social dialogue in a tripartite way.
All right, to keep the promise, we need to adopt an inclusive lens. We need everyone co-creating, working together. And I'm going to cap it there, Alicia. So we want to get that into 140 characters. But that's a fantastic start as we close off the conversation. Thank you very, very much. Bernice, let me come to you. To keep the promise, what might we need to do, Bernice?
Yes, to keep the promise, we need to make sure that workers' rights are not sidelined, and that we focus on developing and investing in robust public employment program that will also expand the needs of the working people, like having public health care, education, among other basic rights that we all need.
My apologies there. I was just about to say, Bernice, it's a fantastic response. I'm going to have to shorten it because we have 140 characters. And I'm going to say that in order to keep the promise, we need to make sure that workers' rights are not sidelined, and we repurpose so that we put the needs of the workers at the center, and we do not forget about social protection. I think we can get that in 140 characters. Thank you so much. DG, let me come to you, Mr. Guy Ryder. I'm going to come to you next. How do we keep the promise? And to close off the sentence, sir, to keep the promise.
Learn the lessons, commit to co-creating a more equal future.
To keep the promise, learn the lessons, commit to co-creating a more equal future. I must say that I feel you've had more practice than everyone else on these short sound bites. So, Prof. Mazzucato, the bar is set high. You are certainly taking us home. So maybe let's hear the final word from you. To keep the promise.
So to keep the promise, I think we need to learn to walk the talk of stakeholder value, put purpose at the center of the system of how all the different co-creating actors actually work together. And we need to sandbox it. Let's test it out. If we can't do it with the vaccine, forget about it. The digital divide, our health systems, let's start actually building and creating different structures together.
All right, I learned something in Twitter. It's called a thread. So it's almost like 2 or 3 tweets stacked together. I think that's what we heard here. But thank you so much, Prof. Mazzucato. We need to walk the talk. We need to put stakeholder value at the center. And hashtag, let's sandbox this. Let's try, let's learn from those lessons, and let's iterate to do better. What an incredible conversation. A massive thank you to all of you. Prof. Mazzucato, for your time. Of course, Alicia Rodriguez Pardo, thank you very much for being here with us. Joanna Bernice, nice Coronacion. And of course, to the Director General of the ILO for hosting us. To the ILO Talks team, thank you so much for these conversations. And from myself, Nozipho, at the tip of the African continent, with the lights on, Prof. Mazzucato for today, ESCOM doing its job. It is goodbye from me for now. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.